My sister-in-law ruined my wedding dress in front of everyone, but what happened after that moment changed how my husband and his family saw her forever that day. It was during the peak of the reception, right after the first dance, where David had spun me around the floor with that boyish grin that had first won me over during our blind date 3 years earlier at a crowded coffee shop in the suburbs where we'd bonded over bad lattes and shared dreams of a quiet life with backyard barbecues and movie nights on the couch, the kind of ordinary happiness that felt revolutionary after my chaotic upbringing. And the barn was alive with the chatter of 70 guests, the clink of silverware on china plates as they enjoyed the plated salmon and roasted vegetables we'd selected after weeks of tasting sessions, the air filled with the warm aroma of baked bread from the rolls and the faint floral notes from the centerpieces I'd agonized over to make sure they weren't too overwhelming. Everything so carefully curated to reflect us as a couple, starting fresh in our new suburban home with its white picket fence and the spare room we joked would one day be a nursery. And I was floating on that cloud of contentment, my cheeks aching from smiling at the toasts from my best friend and David's college roommate who had joked about our slow burn romance, when Rachel, his younger sister by 4 years, the one who had texted me sporadically during the engagement with suggestions that always felt like criticisms, approached our table with a determined stride that didn't match the celebratory vibe, her red dress hugging her figure a bit too tightly as if she wanted to outshine the bride even on this day, and I smiled at her politely, reaching out for what I thought would be a hug, but instead, she stopped short, her eyes glassy from the open bar where she'd been nursing drinks since the cocktail hour, and she launched into words that started innocently enough with a toast to her big brother and his new wife, but quickly veered into territory that made my stomach drop, her voice growing louder as she said things like how I hoped I knew what I was getting into because David had always put family first, their family, the one that was there for him through everything before I came along. And the guests quieted, forks pausing mid-air, eyes turning toward us in confusion, and then it happened. The moment that would replay in my nightmares for months. She raised the glass of red wine she'd been clutching like a weapon, and with a flick of her wrist that couldn't possibly be accidental, she doused the front of my wedding dress, the liquid hitting with a splash that echoed in the sudden silence, soaking the lace and silk in an instant, turning the pristine ivory into a mottled red mess that dripped onto the floor and my shoes, the cold seeping into my skin, making me shiver, not just from the temperature, but from the sheer audacity, the public violation of everything the dress symbolized, my commitment, my joy, my entry into this family. And as I stood there stunned, my mouth open in a silent cry, the inner voice in my head screaming, why on this day? Why me? The guilt creeping in unbidden that perhaps I'd been too absorbed in our couple bubble and not attentive enough to her needs as the sister who had lost her big brother to marriage. But mostly, it was pure, raw pain, the kind that makes your chest tighten and your vision blur with hot tears. And the room exploded with reactions, a collective gasp followed by murmurs of disbelief and what is she doing? Phones being lowered or raised depending on who was filming the horror. And David reacted immediately, his face shifting from bliss to fury in a heartbeat, stepping in front of me protectively, his arm around my shoulders as he told her to stop this right now, this is our wedding, his voice carrying the weight of years of being the responsible one. But Rachel didn't back down, instead doubling down with more confessions spilling out in her intoxicated state about how I was never good enough for him, none of them ever were, she was the one who helped him through every hard time, she knew him best, and now I was taking him away to my perfect little world and leaving her behind. Her words revealing the depth of her attachment, the codependency that his family had always brushed off as sibling closeness, and I saw the change in real time. His parents, who had been beaming all day, now looking at their daughter with a mixture of embarrassment and dawning horror. His mother covering her mouth with her hand, whispering to her husband that this had to stop. She'd gone too far this time. His father nodding grimly as he moved to take Rachel's arm, trying to guide her away while apologizing to us with his eyes. And the rest of the family, the aunts and uncles who had welcomed me with open arms at holidays, now shifting their gazes, some shaking their heads, others pulling out phones to text discreetly, the dynamic fracturing visibly as they witnessed the malice that had been hidden behind family loyalty. And in that instant, I felt both devastated and oddly validated, the grief for my ruined day mixing with a strange relief that the truth was out, that they could no longer deny the tension I'd felt, but never voiced to avoid seeming difficult. And as David led me away to the bridal suite at the back of the venue, his hand gentle on my elbow despite the chaos, murmuring that he was so sorry, he had no idea she would do something like this, and we'd get through it, I could hear the family rallying behind us, someone announcing that the party was winding down early, guests being ushered out with gift bags and awkward hugs, and in the quiet of the suite, as I peeled off the sodden dress, the fabric heavy and ruined beyond any hope of being salvaged, staring at the mirror at my tear-streaked face and the red splotches on my chest like wounds, I let the sobs come, the shock giving way to deep sorrow for the memories tainted, for the photos that would forever capture the stain if any were taken after, but also a spark of hope in David's fierce defense, in the way his family had immediately distanced themselves from Rachel's actions, their texts starting to come to him expressing support for me and concern that this behavior couldn't be ignored anymore, changing how they saw her from the beloved baby sister to someone whose issues needed addressing, someone whose jealousy had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed that day. And as we sat there on the couch in our formal wear, him holding me while I cried into his shirt, the pain still sharp, but the immediate fallout revealing the strength of our bond and the family's willingness to see the truth. I knew this was just the beginning of the hard conversations and the rebuilding, though the hurt lingered heavy, making every breath an effort as we prepared to leave the venue early, the car waiting to take us to the hotel where our wedding night awaited, tainted, but not entirely destroyed by the events that had unfolded so publicly and irreversibly. The hotel suite felt too large and too quiet after the chaos of the barn, the kind of sterile luxury that made every sound echo. The soft click of the door closing behind us, the hum of the minibar fridge, the distant murmur of traffic from the highway below, and I stood in the middle of the room still wearing the hotel robe over my underwear because the ruined dress lay in a sodden heap on the bathroom tile like evidence of a crime scene I couldn't bear to look at again, the red wine having set into stubborn stains that no amount of club soda and frantic dabbing from the venue staff could erase. David hovered near the dresser, loosening his tie with slow, deliberate movements as if any sudden motion might shatter what little composure we both clung to. His eyes red-rimmed not from drinking, but from the effort of holding back his own anger and grief on my behalf. And when he finally spoke, his voice came out rough, cracked at the edges, saying he should have seen this coming, that Rachel had been spiraling for months, but he told himself it was just stress from her job loss last year, from the breakup with the guy she'd dated since college, from feeling left behind while everyone else moved forward into marriages and mortgages and futures. And I wanted to tell him it wasn't his fault, that no one could have predicted she'd choose our wedding as the stage for her unraveling. But the words stuck, because part of me was furious at him too. Not for what she did, but for how long he'd minimized her sharp comments, her passive-aggressive texts about how I was changing him, how I kept him from family dinners, how I was too focused on my career at the marketing firm to notice when his mother needed help after her knee surgery. And that anger felt like betrayal on top of betrayal, making my chest ache with the unfairness of it all. He suggested we order room service, something simple like toast and tea, since neither of us could stomach the thought of the celebratory champagne still chilling in the ice bucket. And when the tray arrived, he set it on the low coffee table between us, pouring chamomile from the tiny pot with hands that trembled just enough for me to notice, and we sat on opposite ends of the couch, the space between us feeling vast even though it was only 3 feet, the kind of distance that grows when trust has been shaken not by the person in front of you, but by someone tied so closely to him that hurting me was also hurting him. I sipped the tea scalding hot, letting it burn my tongue so the physical pain would distract from the deeper one, and finally asked the question that had been clawing at me since the moment the wine hit the lace. Did he know how deep her feelings ran, the way she spoke as if I were stealing him rather than marrying him? And he exhaled long and slow, rubbing his face with both hands before admitting that he'd always known she was possessive, that growing up he'd been the buffer between her and their parents' expectations, the one who drove her to therapy appointments after their father's heart attack when she was 16 and refused to leave her room, the one who talked her down from panic attacks during finals week in college. And he'd let that role define their relationship for too long, never drawing the line where sibling support ended and unhealthy enmeshment began. The confession hung there heavy, and I felt the first real crack in my own defenses, the realization that this wasn't just about a ruined dress or a spoiled reception, but about years of patterns I'd only glimpsed, the way she called him at odd hours with crises only he could fix, the way she'd show up unannounced at our apartment with takeout containers and tears, staying until midnight while I pretended to work in the bedroom so I wouldn't have to witness the intimacy of their shared history that excluded me. Tears came then, not the loud sobs from earlier, but quiet, steady ones that slid down my cheeks and dripped into the tea, and when I looked at him, I saw the same tears mirrored in his eyes, the guilt etching deeper lines around his mouth as he reached across the divide and took my hand, his thumb brushing over my knuckles in the small, familiar rhythm he used when I was anxious about work deadlines, or when the fertility tests came back inconclusive last spring and we decided to pause trying for a baby until things felt less fragile. We didn't sleep together that night, not in the way newlyweds are supposed to. Instead, he pulled the extra blanket from the closet and made a bed on the pull-out couch, while I stayed in the king bed, the sheets still crisp and smelling faintly of industrial lavender. And every time I closed my eyes, I saw the splash of red again, felt the cold shock of it, heard her voice rising over the music saying he deserved someone who understood what family really meant. Around 3 in the morning, I heard him get up, pad to the bathroom, run the tap for a long time as if washing his face could wash away the evening, and when he came back, he didn't return to the couch, but stood by the bed until I shifted over silently, making space, and he slid in fully clothed, lying on his back staring at the ceiling, while I curled on my side facing him, our hands finding each other under the covers in the dark. Neither of us spoke for what felt like hours, but the silence wasn't empty. It was filled with the soft rhythm of our breathing, slowly sinking, the occasional sniffle when one of us wiped our eyes, the knowledge that we were both grieving the same thing in different ways. Him, the sister he thought he knew, me, the perfect day I'd planned down to the last place setting. And yet, here we were, still reaching for each other across the wreckage. At some point, his voice came low and hoarse, promising he would talk to her tomorrow, that this couldn't be swept under the rug like every other outburst, that his family needed to see her behavior for what it was, not just a bad night fueled by alcohol, but a pattern that had hurt me and could hurt others if left unchecked. And I believed him because his tone carried a new resolve, the kind that comes after you've witnessed something irreparable and can no longer pretend it's repairable with apologies alone. By the time the first gray light filtered through the blackout curtains, we were still holding hands, exhausted but not separate, the rawness of the night settling into something quieter, more determined, the understanding that the path ahead would be long, filled with difficult conversations and boundaries we'd never had to set before, but that we would walk it together, starting with the simple act of waking up in the same bed, bruised but breathing, the first fragile thread of trust beginning to reweave itself in the space between our intertwined fingers as the new day waited outside, indifferent to the storm we just survived. The morning after the wedding dawned gray and drizzly, the kind of weather that makes you want to stay under the covers forever. But checkout was at 11, and we had to face the world outside the hotel bubble, so we packed in silence. David folding my ruined dress into a dry cleaning bag the front desk provided, as if careful wrapping could somehow preserve what was already lost. And I kept catching glimpses of myself in the mirror. Puffy eyes, hair still half up from the stylist the day before, the hotel robe swapped for yesterday's jeans and a hoodie that smelled faintly of the barn's wood smoke. And every time I looked, I felt the weight of what came next settle heavier. Telling my parents, who'd flown in from 2 states away and left early last night before the worst of it unfolded, and worse, figuring out how to shield our 10-year-old niece, Sophie, Rachel's daughter, who'd been the flower girl in a white dress that matched mine, beaming as she scattered petals down the aisle with such careful concentration that my heart had swelled watching her. David drove us home through the rain-slicked streets, wipers thumping steadily, neither of us speaking much beyond agreeing we'd stop for coffee at the drive-thru we always used on Sunday mornings, the one with the 2 sweet caramel lattes Sophie begged for whenever we had her for a sleepover. And when we pulled into our driveway, the house looked exactly as we'd left it 2 days earlier, porch light still on because we'd forgotten to turn it off, recycling bin waiting to be brought in, the faint scent of the lavender candle I'd lit before we left hanging in the air. And stepping inside felt like crossing into a different life, one where the wedding photos hadn't been uploaded yet, but the memory of the wine hitting silk was already etched into every surface. My phone buzzed incessantly on the kitchen counter as we unpacked, texts from my mother asking if I was okay, from my best friend sending heart emojis and offers to come over with wine and takeout, from David's mother with a simple, "We're so sorry, sweetheart," that made my throat close up because it was the first time she'd ever called me that without hesitation, and I let David answer most of them while I stood at the sink, rinsing mugs we hadn't even used, needing the small mechanical task to keep my hands from shaking. Around noon, his parents arrived unannounced, umbrellas dripping on the welcome mat, his mother carrying a foil pan of lasagna she'd clearly thrown together that morning as some kind of apology offering, his father trailing behind with the quiet exhaustion of a man who'd spent the night fielding calls from relatives asking what on earth had happened. They hugged me carefully, as if I might break, and his mother's eyes were swollen from crying. She kept saying she should have seen the signs, that Rachel had been drinking more since the divorce finalized 6 months ago, that she'd been talking about David slipping away in ways that sounded possessive even then, but they chalked it up to grief over losing her marriage and her brother's attention shifting to wedding planning. David's father nodded along, adding that they'd driven Rachel home last night after she'd passed out in the backseat of their car, that she woke up this morning hungover and tearful, claiming she didn't remember much but knew she'd ruined everything. And when they pressed her, she dissolved into sobs saying she just wanted her brother back the way he used to be, before me, before the house, before the life that didn't include daily crises she could solve. Hearing it laid out so plainly in our kitchen, with the rain tapping against the windows and the smell of lasagna warming in the oven, made the anger flare fresh, but underneath it was something sharper. Pity mixed with resolve that this couldn't keep happening. Not to me, not to David, and especially not to Sophie, who deserved better than a mother who weaponized her pain at family gatherings. David suggested we all sit down, and we did, around the dining table still cluttered with mail and the centerpiece from our engagement party I hadn't had the energy to put away. And for the first time, we talked about boundaries instead of brushing things off. No more unannounced drop-ins, no more late-night crisis calls unless it was a true emergency involving Sophie, therapy for Rachel strongly encouraged, and family willingness to help pay if insurance didn't cover it, and most importantly, an apology to me that wasn't just words but accompanied by space and accountability. His parents agreed without argument, his mother reaching across to squeeze my hand and saying she'd always seen me as the daughter she never had, that what happened last night wasn't just an embarrassment, it was wrong, and they weren't going to let it slide under the rug anymore, because protecting Rachel's feelings had come at the cost of mine for too long. Later that afternoon, David went to pick up Sophie from his parents' house. She'd spent the night there after the reception ended early, and when they walked in, she ran straight to me, arms wide, asking why the party stopped so soon and if I was sad about my dress because Aunt Rachel spilled juice on it by accident, the child's version of events already softened by whoever had explained it to her. I knelt down, hugged her tight against the ache in my chest, and told her it wasn't juice, it was wine, and it wasn't an accident, but that grown-ups sometimes make big mistakes when they're hurting inside, and that we were all going to work on making things better so it didn't happen again. She nodded solemnly, then asked if she could still have sleepovers here, even if Aunt Rachel was in trouble, and the question cracked something open in me, the fear that this rift might cost her the stability of her aunt and uncle's home, and I promised her, yes, always, that nothing would change how much we loved her. David watched from the doorway, eyes glistening, and when Sophie ran off to play in the living room, he came over, wrapped his arms around me from behind, chin resting on my shoulder, and whispered that we'd protect her together, that he was done letting guilt keep him from drawing hard lines. By evening, the house felt a little less heavy. We ate the lasagna straight from the pan on the couch while watching a mindless sitcom rerun, Sophie curled between us with popcorn, and though the hurt still sat under my ribs like a bruise that hadn't turned colors yet, there was a small shift, a cautious alignment between me and David's parents that hadn't existed before, a shared understanding that Rachel's behavior needed addressing, not just for my sake, but for the family's long-term health. When Sophie fell asleep against my side, her small hand clutching the edge of my hoodie, I looked at David over her head and saw the same quiet determination in his eyes. We aren't erasing what happened, but we are choosing, deliberately, to build something stronger around the truth instead of pretending the crack hadn't appeared. And for the first time since the wine hit the lace, I felt the tiniest flicker of hope that the family I'd married into might finally see me not as the outsider who'd taken their son, but the one worth defending when it mattered most. The drizzle had turned into steady rain by Monday morning, the kind that drums against the roof and windows all day, making the house feel smaller, more contained, and I woke up to the sound of it mixed with David's quiet movements in the kitchen, coffee grinder whirring, mugs clinking, the soft beep of the toaster, and for a fleeting second before memory caught up, I felt the ordinary comfort of routine. Then the ache returned, sharp and familiar, the ruined dress still folded in its bag on the closet floor, like a ghost I couldn't yet face throwing away. We'd agreed the night before, after Sophie went to bed and we sat on the couch with herbal tea neither of us drank much of, that I needed space. Not from him, but from the family orbit that suddenly felt too close, too raw. So when he asked if I wanted to go to my sister's place upstate for the weekend, I said yes without hesitation, the first decisive thing I'd felt since the reception. My sister Claire lived in a small converted barn house about 2 hours north, the kind of place with exposed beams and a wood stove and no cell service in half the rooms, perfect for disappearing into for a few days. She'd texted me late Sunday offering the guest room, no questions asked beyond, "Bring comfy socks, it's cold." And I packed a duffel with leggings, sweaters, the paperback I'd been meaning to finish for months, and the small notebook I sometimes wrote in when therapy felt too exposing to say things out loud. David drove me to the train station because neither of us trusted my focus on the road right now. He kept one hand on the wheel, the other resting on my knee in that steady way he did when traffic was bad or when I was anxious about presentations at work. And we didn't talk much, mostly practical things like what time the train left, whether I needed cash for the cafe car, reminders to text when I arrived. But the silence was softer than it had been the night of the wedding, threaded with something like mutual understanding that we both needed breathing room to sort through the mess Rachel had left. At the platform, he hugged me longer than usual, chin pressed to the top of my head, murmuring that he loved me, that he was proud of me for knowing what I needed, and when I pulled back, I saw the same shadows under his eyes that I felt under mine, the exhaustion of carrying guilt that wasn't entirely his, but still weighed the same. The train ride was a blur of rain-streaked windows and podcasts I barely heard. I stared at my reflection in the glass, older somehow in just 48 hours, and let myself cry quietly into a wad of napkins when the landscape turned from strip malls to rolling hills. The tears less about the dress now, and more about the deeper cut. The fear that marrying into his family meant signing up for periodic eruptions I'd have to absorb to keep the peace. Claire met me at the station with her beat-up Subaru, no makeup, hair in a messy bun, and the second I slid into the passenger seat, she handed me a travel mug of chai without saying a word, just reached over and squeezed my hand once, hard, the way only a sister can when words would be inadequate. We drove the winding roads to her place in companionable quiet, broken by small updates. Her garden was finally producing decent tomatoes this year, the neighbor's dog kept digging under the fence, she'd started seeing a new therapist who specialized in family systems, and when we pulled up to the house, the rain had eased to a mist that made everything look softly watercolor. Inside smelled of wood smoke and bread she'd baked that morning. She showed me to the guest room with its quilted bed and stack of extra blankets, then left me alone to unpack while she puttered in the kitchen. I sat on the edge of the bed for a long time, phone in my lap, scrolling through the wedding photos my best friend had sent. Candid shots before the toast, me laughing with David during cake cutting, Sophie twirling in her flower girl dress. And the contrast between those moments and the memory of red wine spreading made my stomach turn over again. But I didn't delete any of them. Instead, I forwarded a few to David with a simple, "These still make me smile," a small bridge across the distance I'd put between us. Over the next 2 days, Claire and I fell into an easy rhythm, morning walks on the muddy trails behind her property, even when it rained, stopping to watch deer at the edge of the field, afternoons reading on the screened porch with mugs of tea and the occasional shared story, me finally telling her everything, start to finish, the way Rachel's voice had risen, the way David had stepped in front of me, the way his parents had looked at their daughter like they were seeing her for the first time. Evenings cooking simple dinners, pasta with whatever was in the fridge, roasted vegetables, a bottle of red we didn't finish because neither of us wanted to risk the symbolism, and long talks by the fire where I cried and laughed and cried again, and she listened without trying to fix it, just nodding, saying things like, "That must have felt like a public stripping," or "You're allowed to be furious and still love him." By the second night, I was ready to think about rules, boundaries I wanted to set when I went home, Things I wrote in the notebook in careful bullet points. No more unscheduled visits without at least a day's notice. Rachel's calls to David limited to business hours unless Sophie was involved. Full transparency if she reached out to him about anything personal. No more private late-night conversations that left me feeling sidelined. Couples therapy starting soon. Individual for me in the meantime to process the betrayal separately from the marriage. And if Rachel wanted any relationship with me at all, it would have to begin with a sincere, in-person apology and proof she was working on herself, preferably with a therapist's guidance. Writing them out felt like reclaiming ground I hadn't realized I'd surrendered over the last 3 years. The small concessions I'd made to keep the peace. The times I'd bitten my tongue when her comments stung because David would look so torn between us. Claire read the list when I showed her, nodded slowly, then said the quiet thing that stuck with me most. You're not asking for too much. You're asking for what every person deserves in their own marriage. Priority, respect, safety. I texted David the outline that late night, not the full bullet points yet, but the gist, that I was coming home Sunday ready to talk about what we both needed moving forward, that I loved him, but needed us to be a team first, always, and his reply came almost immediately. I'm ready. I've been thinking the same things. Take the time you need. I'll be here. No defensiveness, no excuses, just willingness. And that small exchange loosened something in my chest, made the return trip feel less like walking back into battle and more like stepping toward a conversation we'd both been avoiding for too long. When Claire drove me to the train station Sunday morning, the sun had finally broken through, weak but real, lighting the wet leaves so they sparkled. And as the train pulled away, I watched her wave until she was a small figure on the platform, then turned forward, notebook in my lap, the list of boundaries now a map instead of just a wish list, the first concrete steps towards rebuilding not just after the wine, but after years of quiet erosion I'd pretended wasn't happening. The hurt still lived under my skin, tender when pressed, but the space had given me clarity. I wasn't going home to forgive on demand or pretend nothing had changed. I was going home to demand the transparency and protection I should have insisted on from the beginning. And for the first time, I believed David might meet me there, not out of guilt, but because he wanted the stronger, clearer version of us that I did. The first therapy appointment felt like walking into a room I'd only seen in movies. Soft gray walls, a low couch that sagged comfortably in the middle, a box of tissues within easy reach, the faint scent of eucalyptus from a diffuser on the side table. And I sat alone in the waiting area for 10 minutes before my name was called, scrolling mindlessly through emails on my phone to keep the nerves at bay, the same way I used to before big client pitches at work. Dr. Ellis was in her late 50s. Calm voice, no-nonsense glasses, the kind of person who could ask hard questions without making you feel attacked. She started by asking what brought me in, and I surprised myself by starting not with the wedding, but with the smaller moments that had accumulated over 3 years. The way I'd sometimes leave the room when Rachel called David at 9 at night with another emergency. The way I'd smile through her backhanded compliments at holidays about how brave I was to take on his family baggage. The quiet resentment that had built like plaque until the wine splash felt less like a sudden explosion and more like the final crack in a dam I'd been shoring up alone. She listened without interrupting, nodding occasionally, and when I finished, voice hoarse, hands twisted in my lap, she asked the gentle question that shifted everything. What part of that night still hurts the most when you replay it? I thought it would be the public humiliation, the ruined photos, the dress I'd saved for months to buy, but the words that came out were quieter. It was seeing David's face when he realized how long he'd let her behavior slide, the dawning guilt in his eyes that told me he'd known on some level and chosen not to act, and how that made me question whether I was truly first in his life or just the latest person he was trying to balance against his sister's needs. Dr. Ellis didn't rush to reassure me. Instead, she said we'd start there, with what safety and priority looked like in a marriage, and gave me homework that felt almost childish at first. Every day for the next week, notice one small moment when I felt valued by David and write it down, no matter how minor, and one moment when I felt sidelined, even if it was just a fleeting thought. The notebook I'd started at Claire's became my anchor. The first entry that evening was simple. David had texted mid-afternoon just to say he'd picked up the dry cleaning and asked if I wanted Thai for dinner. A nothing message that still made my chest loosen because he was thinking of me without prompting. And the sidelined one was remembering how, when we were planning the honeymoon we'd postponed, he hesitated over canceling the extra night in case Rachel needed him for something with Sophie during that time. Writing it out didn't erase the sting, but it made the feelings less amorphous, less like a fog I was drowning in, and more like identifiable threads I could begin to untangle. David started his own individual sessions the following week with a different therapist recommended by Dr. Ellis. Boundaries around family was his focus, he told me over takeout one night, the living room lit only by the TV paused on some cooking show neither of us was watching. And though we didn't share details of what came up in those rooms, the fact that he went without me having to push felt like the first real vulnerability he'd offered since the reception. Proof he wasn't just reacting to my hurt, but actively working on the patterns that had fed it. Small acts began to appear between us like tentative shoots after a long winter. He started turning his phone face down during dinner so no notifications from Rachel could interrupt, a rule he set himself and stuck to, even when his mother called once about a family recipe and he let it go to voicemail with an apologetic text that he'd call back tomorrow. I began saying out loud when something triggered an old insecurity instead of swallowing it. The night he mentioned Rachel had texted asking if Sophie could spend the weekend with us, I told him the request made my stomach knot because it felt like her trying to insert herself back into our space too soon. And instead of defending or deflecting, he nodded, said he understood why, and suggested we propose a different weekend when we'd both feel more ready. Those conversations weren't easy. They left us both raw, sitting in silence afterward with cooling plates of pasta, but they ended with him reaching for my hand across the table, thumb brushing my wrist in that old familiar way, and me not pulling away. One evening after my third session, I came home to find him in the kitchen making the chicken curry his mother had taught him years ago, the one with extra cardamom because I liked it that way. And when I asked why, he shrugged and said he'd been thinking about how often I'd adjusted my tastes, my schedule, my expectations to accommodate his family, and he wanted to start doing the same for me, starting with something as small as remembering the spice level I preferred. We ate on the couch, legs tangled under the throw blanket, and for the first time in weeks, the quiet between bites felt companionable rather than loaded. I told him about the homework from therapy, read him a couple of the entries aloud, the good ones mostly, the sidelined ones softened by distance, and he listened with his head tilted against the cushion, eyes steady on mine, then admitted he'd started his own list, things he wanted to change so I never had to question my place again. The tentative contact grew in tiny increments. A good morning text that included a heart emoji he rarely used before. The way he'd pause Netflix when I came home late from work so we could watch the rest together, instead of him finishing alone. The night he suggested we go for a walk after dinner, even though it was cold, just to hold hands and talk about nothing important. School fundraisers for Sophie, the new coffee shop opening downtown, whether we should repaint the spare room someday. Each small gesture felt like testing the ice after a thaw, cautious steps to see if it would hold our weight. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the house began to feel less like a place where the wedding fallout still echoed, and more like the home we'd been trying to build before Rachel's outburst reminded us how fragile the foundation had been. By the end of the month, I noticed I wasn't bracing every time his phone buzzed, wasn't scanning his face for signs of divided loyalty. The hurt hadn't vanished. It still flared when I thought too long at the reception, but it had dulled to something manageable, something I could carry without it crushing me. And when David asked, quietly one Sunday morning over coffee, if I thought we might be ready to try a joint session soon, I surprised us both by saying yes, not because everything was fixed, but because the small vulnerabilities we'd each risked alone had started to knit us back together, thread by careful thread, into something sturdier than before, a marriage that was learning, finally, to prioritize the two of us first, without apology or guilt. The joint session was scheduled for a Thursday evening in early May, the kind of ordinary weekday where the city outside the therapist's window was winding down, commuters heading home with takeout bags, kids in soccer uniforms piling out of minivans, and inside the small office, the air felt thicker, expectant, as if the room itself knew we were about to name things that had stayed unspoken for too long. Dr. Ellis greeted us with the same calm nod she gave me individually, no fanfare, just a quiet invitation to sit wherever felt comfortable. David chose the end of the couch closest to the door at first, then shifted closer to me when he noticed, our knees almost touching, a small, deliberate movement that made my pulse steady instead of race. She started by asking each of us, separately, what we hoped to get from these joint meetings, and I went first because waiting would have made my throat close up. I said I wanted to feel like our marriage was the primary relationship again, not one that had to negotiate around his sister's crises, that I needed to know the boundaries we'd been setting weren't temporary concessions, but permanent shifts, and that I wanted to rebuild trust without always wondering if the next family event would turn into another eruption. David listened with his hands clasped between his knees, head slightly bowed, and when it was his turn, he spoke more slowly, voice rough around the edges. He said he wanted to stop feeling torn in half, to learn how to love his family without letting their needs override ours, to apologize properly, not just for what Rachel did, but for the years he let her behavior slide because it was easier than confronting the guilt of disappointing her. And most of all, he wanted me to feel safe with him, truly safe, the way I used to before the reception. Dr. Ellis let the words settle, then asked us to name the deeper issues underneath the surface ones, the ones that had made the wine incident possible rather than inevitable. David spoke first this time. Codependency, the word he'd been circling in his individual sessions, the way he'd grown up being Rachel's fixer, driving her to school when she was too anxious to take the bus, talking her through every breakup, covering for her when she missed work deadlines, and how that role had become his identity so thoroughly that when I came along, he hadn't known how to expand it to include a wife without feeling like he was betraying the sister who'd needed him first. Hearing him say it out loud in the room with me there felt like a door creaking open. I added my piece, quieter but no less raw. The fear of being seen as the interloper who'd stolen their golden boy. The way I'd internalized Rachel's comments until I second-guessed every decision that prioritized our couple life. The resentment that had built because I was always the one adjusting, compromising, smiling through gritted teeth to keep the peace. We went back and forth like that for nearly the full hour, naming resentments and fears we'd each carried alone. And though the air grew heavy with the weight of it, there was also a strange relief in the naming, as if saying the words aloud stripped them of some of their power to fester in silence. Toward the end, Dr. Ellis suggested a small exercise to turn toward each other on the couch and share one thing each of us appreciated about the other since the wedding, something specific that had helped during the hard weeks. David went first again. He said he appreciated how I'd protected Sophie that first afternoon home, the way I'd knelt down and explained the truth without bitterness so she wouldn't feel caught in the middle, and how my willingness to take space at Claire's had given him the clarity to start therapy without feeling like he was only doing it to placate me. I swallowed hard, then told him I appreciated the small, consistent choices he'd been making, the phone face down at dinner, the way he'd started asking my opinion first on family invitations instead of assuming we'd go, the night he'd canceled a planned weekend with his parents when I admitted I wasn't ready yet, choosing us over obligation. When I finished, he reached for my hand without hesitation, fingers threading through mine, and for the first time since the barn, I didn't feel the ghost of Rachel's presence hovering between us. The touch was just ours, simple and steady. Dr. Ellis ended the session by giving us one piece of homework, to try a same-room ritual once a day for the next week. Nothing elaborate, just 10 minutes sitting together, without phones, without an agenda, maybe holding hands or leaning against each other, letting silence be comfortable instead of something to fill with words. We started that night at home, after Sophie had gone back to her mother's for the weekend, and the house was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional car passing by. We sat on the living room couch, lights low, the throw blanket draped over our legs, and at first the 10 minutes felt awkward, like we were performing intimacy rather than feeling it. But gradually the tension eased, his shoulder against mine, my head eventually resting on his chest, the slow rise and fall of his breathing syncing with my own until the timer on my phone chimed softly. We didn't speak right away. Instead, he lifted my hand to his lips, kissed the knuckles one by one, a gesture so tender it caught in my throat, and when I looked up, his eyes were wet but steady. The ritual became our anchor over the following days. Morning coffee on the back porch before work, hands linked across the small table while the neighbor's sprinkler hissed. Evenings after dinner when we'd move to the couch and simply sit, sometimes talking about mundane things, the new principal at Sophie's school, the leak in the guest bathroom we needed to fix, sometimes saying nothing at all, just breathing together. Each time the silence grew less fragile, the closeness less tentative. One night, I surprised myself by shifting closer until I was curled into his side, his arm around my shoulders, and when he pressed a kiss to my temple, I didn't pull away or tense. I let it land, let the warmth spread, let myself remember what safety with him had felt like before doubt crept in. By the second joint session, the following week, we reported back to Dr. Ellis that the ritual had started to feel natural, almost necessary, like recalibrating a compass that had been off by degrees for years. She smiled, small, professional, but real, and asked if we were ready to talk about forgiveness, not as a single event, but as a process, and we both nodded, not because the hurt had vanished, but because the small steps we'd taken together had created enough space for it to begin. As we left the office that evening, hand in hand down the hallway, the rain starting again outside, but softer this time, I felt the first true flicker of something beyond cautious hope, a quiet certainty that we were rebuilding not just the marriage we had before, but one that had been tested and chosen again, deliberately, in the same room where we'd sat worlds apart, now close enough that our shadows overlapped on the wet pavement as we walked to the car together. The idea for the family weekend came from Sophie, of all people. During one of her Friday after-school drop-offs at our house in late June, when the days were long and humid and the backyard smelled of cut grass and chlorine from the neighbor's pool. She'd been quieter lately, picking up on the undercurrents even if no one spelled them out for her. Rachel had been attending court-mandated anger management and individual therapy since May, seeing Sophie only during supervised visits at her parents' house, and the absence had left a small hollow in our routines that Sophie filled with extra questions and clingier hugs. That afternoon, she sat at the kitchen island, swinging her legs while I chopped vegetables for tacos, watching me with those serious eyes she'd inherited from her mother, and asked if we could all go somewhere together soon, like before everything got weird, adding that she missed camping because last summer we'd roasted marshmallows and told ghost stories, and nobody had argued about anything important. The simplicity of it pierced me. I glanced at David across the room where he was sorting mail, and our eyes met in the kind of silent conversation we'd been practicing. Quick assessment, shared hesitation, then a small nod of agreement that, yes, maybe it was time to test the waters, not just between us, but with the wider family circle that had been fractured since the wedding. We settled on a cabin rental 2 hours north, the same state park where David's parents used to take the kids every August when he and Rachel were young. Pine trees thick enough to muffle sound, a small lake with a sandy shore, cabins with screened porches and no Wi-Fi to force everyone offline. His parents booked the largest one with 3 bedrooms. We drove up Friday after work with Sophie buckled between us in the backseat, chattering about the s'more she planned to make and the canoe she wanted to take out at dawn, while David and I held hands over the center console, thumbs brushing in quiet reassurance. Rachel arrived separately on Saturday morning, her first extended time with the family since the reception, her first time seeing me since she'd stood in front of the head table with a wine glass raised like a weapon. She looked different in small, deliberate ways. Hair pulled back plainly, no makeup, jeans and a faded hoodie instead of the tight dresses she used to favor, carrying a canvas tote with board games and a bag of Sophie's favorite cookies as if offerings could bridge the gap. When she stepped onto the porch, David's mother went to her first, hugging her tightly but briefly, whispering something I couldn't hear. His father nodded once, gruff but not cold. Then Rachel turned to me, eyes already glassy, and said in a voice so low the lake breeze almost carried it away, "I'm sorry. I know words aren't enough yet, but I'm here to listen if you ever want to talk, and I'm working every day to make sure nothing like that happens again." I didn't hug her. Couldn't, yet. But I met her gaze and said thank you for coming, for trying. And the moment passed without explosion or false warmth, just a careful acknowledgement that we were both in the same space and choosing not to flee. The weekend unfolded in small, ordinary pieces that carried unexpected weight. Saturday afternoon, we all walked the trail to the lake, Sophie skipping ahead to collect pine cones while the adults trailed in loose formation, David and I side by side, his parents a few steps behind with Rachel between them like fragile cargo they were still learning how to carry without breaking. Conversation stayed surface level at first, weather, bug spray brands, which cabin had the better view, then gradually deepened when Sophie asked Rachel why she'd been gone so long, and Rachel knelt down, took her daughter's hands, and gave the age-appropriate version. I made a big mistake because I was really sad and angry inside, and I hurt people I love, including you and Aunt, my name. I'm getting help so I can be better, and I'm really sorry I made things scary. Sophie listened solemnly, then hugged her mother hard enough to knock them both off balance, and when they stood, Rachel's eyes found mine over Sophie's head. Grateful, ashamed, determined, and I felt the first real loosening in my chest. Not forgiveness exactly, but the beginning of space where it might one day grow. That evening, around the fire pit, the air cooled fast. We wrapped in blankets, roasted marshmallows on long sticks, and let Sophie dictate the storytelling. Ghost stories first, then silly ones about talking animals, then quieter ones where she asked each of us what we were most thankful for this year. When it was my turn, I paused, watching the flames flicker across their faces, David's steady gaze on me, his parents' soft smiles, Rachel's careful stillness, and said I was thankful for second chances, for people willing to look at hard truths and choose differently, for a family that was learning how to hold everyone without anyone having to disappear. David squeezed my hand under the blanket, his mother reached over to pat my knee, Rachel wiped her eyes quickly with her sleeve and murmured, "Me too." Later, after Sophie had fallen asleep on the couch inside and the others had gone to bed, David and I stayed by the dying fire, embers popping softly, and he pulled me close so my back rested against his chest, arms wrapped around me against the night chill. We didn't speak for a long time, just watched the glow fade to red. Then he kissed the side of my neck and whispered that he'd never felt prouder to be married to me than he did right then, seeing how I'd held space for healing without losing myself. I turned in his arms, kissed him properly for the first time since the hotel suite, slow, searching, the kind of kiss that remembered what desire felt like before fear crowded it out. And when we finally went inside to our bedroom, the door closed softly behind us, we made love quietly, carefully, the way people do when they're rediscovering each other's bodies as safe territory again. Every touch an apology and a promise woven together. Sunday morning dawned clear and cool. We packed up slowly, Sophie helping Rachel fold blankets, while David and his father loaded the car, his mother and I rinsing dishes in the tiny kitchen sink. She bumped my shoulder gently and said, "You've given us all a gift, showing us what strength looks like when it's quiet." And I felt tears prick unexpectedly, because it was the closest thing to full acceptance I'd ever heard from her. The drive home was filled with Sophie's sleepy chatter from the back seat, Rachel following in her own car a respectful distance behind, and when we pulled into our driveway, David turned off the engine, leaned over, and kissed me again, longer this time, unhurried, then said, "We did it. Not perfect, but real." The weekend hadn't erased the scar of the wine-stained dress and the months of tension that followed, but it had layered something new over the wound. Shared effort, small reconciliations, the physical closeness that reminded us both we were still here, still choosing each other. And as we unpacked groceries and Sophie ran to show her new pine cone collection to the neighbor's cat, I felt the hard-earned closeness settle into my bones. Not fragile anymore, but tested, scarred, and stronger for it. A family bond that had bent nearly to breaking and somehow learned to hold without crushing anyone in the process. A year to the day after the reception, the calendar notification on my phone popped up at 7:14 a.m. while I was pouring coffee into the same chipped blue mug I'd used every morning since we moved into this house. Wedding anniversary. And I stared at it for a long moment, the steam curling up between me and the screen, before turning off the reminder without opening it, because marking the occasion with balloons or reservations felt wrong, like trying to paper over a scar that had healed crooked, but strong. Instead, we'd planned something quieter, something that fit the life we'd rebuilt, piece by careful piece. A Saturday at home with no agenda beyond being together, the kind of day we used to take for granted before everything cracked open and taught us gratitude could be deliberate. David was already up, barefoot in the kitchen making pancakes the way his mother used to, extra vanilla, blueberries folded in at the last second so they didn't turn the batter purple. And when he saw me, he smiled the small, private smile that had become our shorthand for, "We made it through another week," then came over and kissed my forehead, lingering long enough that I felt the warmth of him settle the last traces of morning tension. Sophie arrived at 10 with Rachel, the two of them pulling up in Rachel's gray SUV that still had the faint dent from the fender bender she had last fall, a reminder she was human and fallible and still working every day to stay steady. Rachel had been sober for 14 months now, attending therapy twice a week in a support group on Tuesdays, and though we weren't close, not friends, not confidants, we'd found a functional civility that held when Sophie was around and sometimes even when she wasn't. Today, she carried a bakery box with a lemon tart I liked, not the chocolate one she preferred, a small gesture that no longer felt like manipulation, but like genuine effort. She set it on the counter with a quiet, "Happy anniversary," eyes meeting mine briefly before dropping to the floor, and I said thank you, meaning it, because the words no longer tasted bitter on my tongue. Sophie, 11 now and all elbows and opinions, hugged me first, then David, then dragged Rachel outside to show her the new swing set we'd assembled last month, the one with the tire swing she'd begged for after seeing it in a catalog. The afternoon passed in the slow, unhurried rhythm of ordinary life that had become our greatest luxury. David grilling burgers on the back patio while I set the picnic table with mismatched plates and the blue gingham cloth we'd bought on our postponed honeymoon trip to Maine 6 months ago. Sophie running through the sprinkler in her swimsuit, shrieking every time the cold water hit her. Rachel sitting on the grass with a book she pretended to read while mostly watching her daughter with the careful attentiveness of someone who knew how easily trust could be lost. His parents came around 3, bringing potato salad and stories about the garden they'd finally started after years of talking about it, tomatoes thriving, basil going wild, and when we all sat down to eat, the conversation flowed without the old undercurrents of tension. No one tiptoeing, no one dominating. We talked about Sophie's upcoming middle school transition, the new math teacher everyone said was tough but fair, David's promotion at the engineering firm that meant more remote days and less commuting, my decision to take on fewer freelance clients so I could breathe again, and when Rachel mentioned she'd started a part-time job at the library shelving books and helping with children's story hour, the table went quiet for a beat, not awkward, just attentive, before his mother reached over and squeezed her hand, saying, "That sounds perfect for you," and Rachel's shoulders dropped a fraction, the relief visible in the way she exhaled. After dinner, we moved to the living room for cake, chocolate with vanilla frosting, Sophie's choice, and when David lit the single sparkler candle we'd stuck in the center because neither of us wanted the fuss of numbers, everyone sang off-key and laughing, Sophie blowing it out before I could because wishes are stronger when kids do them. Later, when the sun had dipped low enough to turn the backyard gold and the mosquitoes started biting, Sophie and Rachel said goodbye with hugs that lingered a little longer each time, Rachel murmuring something to David about picking Sophie up next weekend for a movie, and he nodded without hesitation, no glance my way for permission, because we'd already talked it through, boundaries clear and mutual. His parents left soon after, his mother hugging me extra tight at the door and whispering, "You two are doing something really good here," her voice thick with the kind of pride that comes after witnessing repair instead of just celebration. When the house was finally quiet again, just the hum of the dishwasher and the faint cricket chorus starting outside, David and I sat on the couch with the last slices of cake we didn't really want, legs tangled under the throw blanket, the TV off for once. He took my hand, turned it over, traced the faint line on my palm where I'd nicked myself opening a box of wedding invitations a lifetime ago, and said quietly that he still thought about that night sometimes, not with the same gut-punch guilt anymore, but as the moment everything had to change or break completely, and how grateful he was that we'd chosen change, even when it hurt. I told him I still saw the red wine in dreams occasionally, still felt the cold shock on my skin, but the memory had lost its sharpness. It was part of our story now, not the whole thing, and the parts that came after, the therapy notes in my nightstand drawer, the mornings we woke up reaching for each other without thinking, the way Sophie called us both home when she walked through the door, those were the ones that mattered more. We didn't make grand promises or declarations. We didn't need to. Instead, we sat there until the room grew dark, his head eventually resting on my shoulder, my fingers in his hair, the silence between us comfortable and full, the kind that holds everything we'd carried through the year. Anger that had burned clean, grief that had softened, forgiveness that arrived not as a thunderclap, but as a slow, steady accumulation of small, chosen acts. When we finally went to bed, he pulled me close under the covers, kissed the spot behind my ear that always made me shiver, and murmured, "Happy anniversary," like it was the most ordinary truth in the world, and I whispered it back, meaning every syllable. The scar from that day remained, faint but permanent, like the wine stain no dry cleaner could fully lift, but around it had grown something tougher, more flexible, a bond that had been broken open and re-sewn with deliberate stitches, stronger at the mended places, capable of holding us and the people we loved without anyone having to disappear or diminish. In the quiet dark, listening to his breathing even out beside me, I felt the quiet, realistic hope that had carried us this far settle deeper. Not that we'd never hurt again, but that we'd learn how to face it together, how to choose repair over rupture, how to build a family that could bend and scar and still stand, scarred but whole, changed but ours.